Alright guys, so today we're going to be doing a new unit, and it's over waste management and human health and environmental risk, which if you look in the chapter, it is chapter 17, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So risk assessment, we're going to be looking at risk, which is going to be a possibility of suffering from some sort of hazard or that can cause injury or disease or death. So things like lung cancer from smoking a pack a day, which bad, everybody bad. And then you have risk assessment, where you're assessing the risk that is happening to the exposure to a hazard. And then you have risk management, which is going to be how you're going to effectively reduce risk to a certain level. So we're going to be looking at this with the populations. It's an extension to populations and food, and now we're going into hazards. So non-transmissible diseases, these are going to be diseases that don't spread by living organisms. So you have cardiovascular, you have cancer, and what you actually have is risk factors that could affect your diseases in humans. So some things like low weight during childhood, you have high blood pressure, unsafe sex, and unsafe water, sanitation, and hygiene. Those could all affect your non-transmissible diseases, along with tobacco use, overweight, obesity, physical inactivity, things like that, in high-income countries. So you have a diversity with how non-transmissible diseases can affect, either through low-income countries or high-income countries. So you see the difference there in how in high-income countries we have tobacco use. We have a lot of overweight people, which we saw in populations unit and also in the food unit. So moving on, where in the world have new diseases emerged? So we see diseases in the United States. You see a lot of them in Europe, and you'll see them in Africa. Infectious diseases, these are going to be transmissible, so diseases spread by living organisms or a pathogen. They could be from air, food, water, body fluids, so like sneezing or saliva. And 80% of our infectious diseases are in developing countries. They're actually waterborne, so you have a lot of issues intestinally with your infectious diseases. So you also have issues with bacterial diseases, and eventually you'll get antibiotic resistance. So it's kind of like the pesticide treadmill, in how you always have to make a new pesticide. You always have to make a new antibiotic because there's antibiotic resistance in humans. So that's why people, you need to take all of your antibiotics in that 10-day period, because if not, you start getting a resistance to antibiotics. So FYI on that one. So some pathways for infectious diseases, we have pets. Pets will bring infectious diseases to us. Livestock, wild animals, mosquitoes are big about this. Food, water, and air all can bring in infectious diseases. And then those could affect humans and other humans and even babies. So FYI on Zika. Zika is where female mosquitoes, they'll lay their eggs in some wood that has water. The eggs will fall into the water, and they love to swim around and make babies in the water. And you'll see in this chart, before genetically modified mosquito release, so we had genetically modified mosquitoes that are not able to reproduce and spread Zika virus. You'll see that after genetically modified release, you have a difference in the populations. So the idea was, let's make some genetically modified mosquitoes so you can have them breed with the natural mosquitoes, and once they breed, they pass on the trait to not have the Zika virus. So there's still going to be mosquitoes, but they can't spread diseases. So that's the new way of doing mosquito prevention and disease prevention. and we'll see this lab in a few days, and we'll get to have hands-on with Zika virus and how they release. So let's keep going. We're going to do that later. So we have zoonotic diseases. We have, should we eradicate mosquitoes? Why killer viruses are on the rise. Viruses aren't new. They've just started getting new and popular in science itself. If you want to, you can click on any of these and you can read the articles that deal with mosquitoes and viruses. So we have Avian Bird Flu. This was huge a couple years ago, and it actually created a lot of scary, it created a lot of worry in the populations because shorebirds would affect waterfowl. Waterfowl will affect our domestic birds, like our chickens. So we have a lot of chickens. I have chickens, but I'm just saying when chickens are affected, we eat eggs, we eat chicken itself. Those will affect other organisms like pigs, but they also affect humans. And pigs, especially swine, are going to affect humans very well. And so how viruses will jump species, they can either do a direct jump, they can do an adaptation among species, or they can reassortment. So a waterfowl could affect a pig, humans can affect pigs, and then pigs can turn around and affect humans. So the avian bird flu was very scary, and it created a lot of havoc. We have HIV and AIDS, which has affected the human population quite a bit, and the origin is from monkeys and apes, and it transmitted to humans. Then we have Ebola virus. There's actually hot spots of forced fragmentation, and as humans were in contact with this. So the Ebola is animal to animal transmission from like bats to gorillas to deer to monkeys or apes. And then there's also any of these animals transmitting to humans, and then humans to human contact. So you could get it from funeral practices, so that was an issue. And how do you deal with your human death, and how do you do a funeral if you don't want to get Ebola? An unprotected healthcare worker, so trying to care for those with Ebola, you could get Ebola as well. And then unprotected contact with blood and bodily fluids. So again, caring for those with Ebola and somehow getting it yourself. So you could survive these challenges and recover. It's just some were not very effective and they were dead. So one way is through bat to human, and this could be done by urbanization, so going into the bat's region. Also cultural practices where you deal with bats, and then ecotourism, so bat watching. And intermediate hosts could be anything like a horse, some sort of small mammal, a gorilla, or a pig. And this could be transmitted to humans by trade, again, cultural practices, or international travel, so people coming in. So like immigration going out to other countries. And then with the bats could go to intermediate hosts through intrinsic factors like pregnancy or eating. Agricultural practices is a big one. And then socioeconomic factors. So West Nile virus is another emerging infectious disease. We hit a huge spike in 2012 and 2002. That's where we saw the most illnesses, and it kind of does this up and down. It'll stay up really for 1 year, and then it'll go down, and then it'll fluctuate throughout the years. So talking about toxicology, you have chemical toxins. This is going to be temporary or permanent harm. Toxicology is where you're going to examine the effects of chemicals on humans and wildlife. And then toxicity is going to measure how harmful a substance is. We'll actually do a little calculation on toxicity with Tide Pods, because Tide Pods was a big challenge a couple years ago. So we're going to see how many Tide Pods it would take for you to, how it would be harmful to humans. So also to deal with toxicity, we're going to look at bioaccumulation and biomagnification in LD50. Bioaccumulation is going to be increasing the concentration of chemical in your body. Biomagnification is going to be increasing the concentration, but through the trophic levels in the food chain. So as you go higher in the food chain, the biomagnification, you're going to have more of a toxicity than you would at the bottom of the food chain. This is why, like, for example, women that are pregnant should not eat tuna because they're higher in the food chain and they could actually get a lot of mercury from the tuna. So that is a big issue. And also you have LD50, which means lethal dose for 50% of the test animals. So 50% of your test animals that are affected with toxicity is going to die. So you're going to calculate the numbers for that. And we're actually going to do that with plants, and we're going to see the LD50 of plants and how much salt they can have in order to maintain a normal lifestyle, and also how many would actually die from salt concentrations. And then you have determining toxicity. We have case reports, lab investigations, epidemiology, and we determine our levels of toxicity through a couple of things. We look at how much in your dose. You look at your genetic makeup, so how sensitive are you to toxins? Solubility, is it flat or water soluble? And then persistence, is it degradable at all? Is it slowly degradable or is it biodegradable? And then synergistic effects, and seeing how harmful it could be. So an example is asbestos in workers and smokers. Asbestos used to be really prominent in human houses, and especially older houses, and it can actually cause a lot of issues in your body. So we have children are being more susceptible to toxins for 3 reasons. So these are really big to know. You really need to know that children are more susceptible to toxicity and toxins. 1, they breathe more air, they drink more water, eat more food. They have little bodies, so they have to accumulate more in order to survive. They are also exposed to toxins in dust or solids when they put objects in their mouth. Children are notorious for putting things in their mouth that they should not do, but it happens. And then children have less developed immune systems. They're very vulnerable to diseases, so FYI on that. Alright, so the next thing is dose response curve. This is where you're going to plot a data showing the effects of doses from toxic agents. You really need to know what a dose response curve is. So take time and sketch this out. You really need to know this for upcoming AP exam and for my exam too. And you may or may not see it on a Canvas quiz, FYI. Also, you have linear dose response model, so any dose has a risk that could cause harm, and then you have threshold dose model. Here is a dose response curve. You can see that there is the LD50. LD50 is where there's a lethal dose to 50% of the mortality rate. So if you look at this chart, the LD50 would be at 10 milligrams per kilogram. That would be the dose. So again, dose response curve shows the percent mortality rate, or LD50, and you can tell how much of that dose it would take to kill half the population. And then we have linear dose response curve, and then we have nonlinear. And it's basically the same concept. And now we have acute exposure and chronic exposure. Acute is a sudden and severe exposure. It's all of a sudden happening, like carbon monoxide. And chronic is going to be over many days or months or years. So symptoms may not show up immediately, but it could show up later, and it's